Ivan Bolotnikov, a former military serf who was captured by Crimean Tatars and sold into slavery in the Ottoman Empire, not only survived but managed to escape. He journeyed through European lands, observing and absorbing experiences before returning to Russia. It was there, on the brink of a new time of troubles, that he met emissaries of False Dmitry II, who without hesitation bestowed upon him the title of his great military commander. Thus, from a runaway serf and former slave, Bolotnikov transformed into the leader of a grand rebellion that encompassed dozens of cities and thousands of souls. He marched his army directly on Moscow, causing the Kremlin walls to tremble. It is crucial to understand that this was not merely a spontaneous uprising of dispossessed peasants. It was a carefully orchestrated operation, sanctioned by the pretender, who sought to exploit popular discontent for his own ends. Bolotnikov was not a naive leader. He was an instrument that almost turned Rus's upside down. This instrument, which nearly shattered the state, was forged in the crucible of inhuman trials. From birth, he was merely property, an appendage to the land or his master, deprived of the right to freedom, to choice, to his very identity. Such an environment did not just oppress, it warped the psyche, fostering either submission or a smoldering, consuming hatred for any manifestation of authority. In Bolotnikov's case, this hatred only intensified, fueled by every new blow of fate: capture, transformation into a human commodity, sale in the slave market. These were not just biographical stages, but a series of profound traumas, severing a person's connection to their world, their past, their identity. Imagine. Yesterday you were, albeit a serf, still a part of familiar Rus, and today you are an anonymous slave in a foreign land, perhaps chained to a galley oar or toiling in mines, where every breath portends the end. These were not merely physical torments. They represented the complete obliteration of human dignity, a reduction to the level of livestock. And it was in this abyss, in this utter darkness of slavery, far from his native lands, that Ivan Bolotnikov reached his point of no return. He did not break. On the contrary, every humiliation, every torture, every day spent in chains only hardened his will, transforming despair into a cold, calculating resolve. His escape from Ottoman captivity was not just a fortunate turn of events. It was an act of colossal will, a breakthrough from hell that only a person who had lost everything but the thirst for freedom and, perhaps, revenge could accomplish. And this is where his second birth began, what truly made him a unique figure of the time of troubles. Traveling through European lands, he did not merely pass through them. He saw a world where different laws operated, where peasants were not universally property, where royal power was not always absolute, where ideas of rights and freedoms were emerging, albeit in their most primitive forms. He, a man from a world where freedom was the privilege of the chosen few, observed a life that was fundamentally different. These observations, this experience of encountering a different world, instilled in him something more than just resentment. They gave him the understanding that the existing order was not the only possible one, that it could and should be broken. He returned to Russes not just as a runaway serf, but as a man who had seen beyond the horizon, who had passed through a personal hell and emerged with new, dangerous knowledge. He was filled not only with personal bitterness, but also, perhaps, with a vague but powerful awareness of social injustice, reinforced by what he had seen in Europe. This made him an ideal recipient for the pretender's ideas. False Dmitry II offered him not just freedom or a title. He offered him an instrument to express all the pain and anger that had accumulated in Bolotnikov over decades of deprivation. He offered him the opportunity to become not just a leader of a revolt, but a symbol of retribution, a living embodiment of the popular discontent that he had so acutely felt on his own skin. He was not merely a pawn, but a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at the slightest spark. But why did this ticking time bomb, Ivan Bolotnikov, prove so vital precisely at that moment? To answer this question, we need to survey all of Russes at the beginning of the 17th century. This was a time when the state, like an ancient colossus, stood on feet of clay. The end of the Rurikid dynasty, the death of the childless Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, brought Boris Godunov to the throne. His reign, which began with hopes for stability, quickly plunged into a whirlpool of suspicion and fear. Society, accustomed to centuries of dynastic succession, found itself disoriented. Godunov's legitimacy was constantly questioned, and this sense of fragility only intensified with each passing year. To compound all misfortunes, the country was hit by 3 years of unprecedented crop failures, from 1601 to 1603. Grain rotted in the fields, granaries emptied, and famine, knowing no social strata or borders, mowed down people by the thousands. People ate goosefoot, tree bark, and resorted to cannibalism. The price of bread soared, ruining the already impoverished population. The government tried to distribute supplies from royal granaries, but this was merely a drop in the ocean of boundless suffering. The economy was shattered, trade paralyzed, and peasants, deprived of their livelihoods, abandoned their lands and left for nowhere, swelling the ranks of vagrants and bandits. This was not just hunger. It was a social catastrophe that undermined the last vestiges of trust and authority. Against this backdrop, the encirclement of peasants intensified, their final attachment to the land and their landlords. This decision, intended to stabilize the labor force amidst ruin, only added fuel to the fire of popular discontent. Serfs, black Soka peasants, urban poor, Cossacks, every layer of society harbored deep grievances, their own scores to settle with the ruling elite. Boyars and nobles were dissatisfied with the strengthening of royal power, and at times with humiliations from Godunov, who saw them as potential conspirators. Service people who received no pay or land felt deprived and sought any opportunity to improve their situation. Cossacks, always inclined to a life of unfettered freedom and recognizing no authority above their own, saw in the chaos an opportunity for gain and the assertion of their independence. And the common people, exhausted by hunger and lawlessness, increasingly believed in the ancient legend of a good Tsar who would come to restore justice, punish evil boyars, and alleviate their plight. All these disparate but powerful currents of discontent, like underground rivers, merged into a single, crushing torrent. One must not forget the psychological backdrop. For the people of that era, famine and plague were not merely natural catastrophes but a sign of God's wrath, a harbinger of the end of the world. Rumors of the miraculously saved Tsarevich Dmitry, the only legitimate heir, who was allegedly killed on Godunov's order, spread with the speed of a steppe fire. These rumors, reinforced by popular superstitions and prophecies, created fertile ground for any pretender. Anyone who could convincingly assume this role instantly gained sacred legitimacy in the eyes of the people. The people were not just dissatisfied, they were ready for redemption, for purification. Through revolt, seeing in the appearance of the true Tsar divine intervention. It was in this atmosphere of universal despair and vague hopes, when society was ready to believe any tale, so long as it promised change, that the force which Bolotnikov would lead was born. This force, born of despair and vague hopes, immediately found its leader in Ivan Bolotnikov. He wasted no time, launching his own carefully calculated game, a key element of which was a daring mystification. Bolotnikov did not proclaim himself Tsar, which would have been too risky and inevitably aroused suspicion. Instead, he assumed the role of the great military commander of the miraculously saved Tsarevich Dmitry. This was a brilliant strategic decision. The people were already prepared to believe the tale of the good Tsarevich, and Bolotnikov, as his envoy, gained sacred legitimacy without burdening himself with the need to prove royal descent. He was merely executing the will of the true sovereign, who, according to him, was somewhere in Poland or Lithuania and was about to appear. This initial deception, a trick concerning identity, instantly transformed the runaway serf into the standard-bearer of a popular movement. The second, no less powerful deception, was the so-called enticing proclamations, Prelestnie pisma. These appeals, circulated in the name of Tsar Dmitry, promised what millions of Russian people could only dream of: complete freedom from serfdom, the right to land, the cancellation of debts, and most importantly, just retribution. The letters urged peasants, serfs, and the urban poor to exterminate traitorous boyars, nobles, and officials, to plunder their property and divide it among themselves. This was not merely propaganda. It was a call for a total social revolution, masterfully disguised as a royal decree. Bolotnikov, or those behind him, perfectly understood the aspirations and hatred of the oppressed masses. These letters acted as a detonator, igniting centuries of discontent and channeling it into an organized, albeit chaotic, rebellion. Against the backdrop of these two key mystifications, a third, most complex deception unfolded: the creation of an army unprecedented in its composition. Bolotnikov managed to gather an incredibly motley crowd under his banners. Not only landless peasants and runaway serfs flocked to him, but also Don and Volga Cossacks, always inclined to a life of unfettered freedom, as well as impoverished nobles and service people, dissatisfied with Godunov, and seeking any opportunity to improve their situation. Even a part of the provincial nobility, deceived by promises or simply wishing to settle scores with the Moscow boyars, joined his army. Bolotnikov skillfully played on the contradictions between these groups, promising each their own: freedom and land to some, new ranks and estates to others, and to all, a true Tsar and justice. This was a fragile but powerful coalition, united only by a common enemy, the Moscow government, and belief in the legend of the miraculously saved Tsarevich. Under the banners of the Tsar's military commander, this force began to grow rapidly. In July 1606, Bolotnikov took Putovo, which became his first major base. This was followed by the town of Kromy, where his army achieved a significant victory over government forces. Kaluga, Serpukhov, one after another, cities opened their gates or were taken by storm. The popular masses, exhausted by hunger and lawlessness, saw Bolotnikov and his Tsar as their saviors. News of the Tsar's military commander and his promises spread with the speed of a steppe fire, and by the autumn of 1606, Bolotnikov's army, numbering tens of thousands of people, stood at the walls of Moscow, ready to unleash all its accumulated fury upon it. This was the apogee of his daring strategy, the result of the skillful exploitation of popular aspirations, and a grand deception that almost overthrew the Russian state. Behind the Kremlin walls, the trembling was not only from fear of the multi-thousand-strong army, but also from incomprehension. How did a former slave, a man of no lineage, manage to gather such a force? The answer lies not only in his daring deceptions, but also in Ivan Bolotnikov's incredible gift, his almost hypnotic ability to manipulate human souls. He didn't just promise. He saw in each of his supporters not a faceless mass, but an instrument that could be tuned to the desired frequency, using their pain, their hopes, their anger. His personal history, his journey from slave to military commander, was not a shameful past for him. On the contrary, he transformed it into a powerful resource, living proof that anyone can cast off chains if they only dare. It was this that gave him the charisma that captivated hearts. He spoke to serfs and peasants in their language, to Cossacks as an equal, and to impoverished nobles as allies in a struggle for justice that each understood. In their own way, Bolotnikov was not just a military commander but a self-taught psychologist, intuitively understanding what motivated people: hunger, the thirst for land, the desire for freedom, but most importantly, a deeply hidden malice and a desire for revenge against those who had oppressed them for decades. Bolotnikov masterfully exploited not only despair, but also the most primitive human greed. His enticing proclamations were just the tip of the iceberg. In every village, in every hamlet where his detachments entered, he or his emissaries personally confirmed promises. The land would be yours. The boyar's property would be shared. Debts would be forgiven. He created precedents, demonstrative actions, where captured estates were immediately divided among the rebels, and their former owners were subjected to brutal reprisals. This was not just propaganda. It was a demonstration that his words were not empty promises but a reality that could be touched and obtained here. And now, this approach transformed each new supporter not just into a soldier, but into an interested participant in a grand redistribution where everyone gained something concrete, be it a tenth of land or a pair of horses. He skillfully fueled this fire of personal gain, transforming disparate groups into a unified fist driven by avarice and revenge. His techniques of influence extended far beyond primitive promises. Bolotnikov knew how to form a team around him that could be called his expert staff. These were not always noble or educated people, but those who possessed undeniable authority in their environment. Experienced Cossack atamans, who could gather hundreds of fighters. Village elders whose words their fellow villagers listened to. Even former clerks and literate serfs who could read and write, capable of conveying the Tsar's will to the most remote corners, giving it the appearance of an official decree. He delegated authority to them, made them feel important. transforming them from mere executors into accomplices and active disseminators of his idea. It was these experts who created the very excitement, as rumors of the miraculous salvation of the Tsarevich and the coming justice spread faster than any messenger, becoming embellished with incredible details and miracles. They were his voice on the ground, his eyes and ears, ensuring a constant influx of new supporters and maintaining morale even under the most difficult conditions. Bolotnikov's ability to adapt was truly phenomenal. He was not a rigid general acting by textbooks or regulations. His strategies changed on the fly, adjusting to the constantly changing situation and the social composition of his army. He learned from his mistakes, quickly correcting actions, whether it was battle tactics, methods of attracting new forces, or even the wording of his appeals. If the nobility showed indecision, he increased pressure on the peasants, offering them even more radical measures, thereby prompting the nobles to choose a side. If some promises didn't work, new, more tempting ones appeared, addressed to specific segments of the population. His experience of slavery and travels through European lands, where he saw fundamentally different ways of life, taught him incredible mental flexibility and readiness for unconventional solutions. He understood that old rules could and should be broken, that hierarchy was not eternal, and that people, driven to despair, were capable of incredible acts if given a convincing leader and a bright, albeit false, hope. He did not just lead an army. He was a masterful conductor of chaos that almost engulfed the entire state. His personal toolkit, forged in the hell of suffering and tempered in European wanderings, proved to be a lethally dangerous weapon in the hands of a man who had nothing to lose. But who directed this deadly weapon, and against whom was it aimed? Behind Bolotnikov stood an unseen puppet master, False Dmitry II, the very pretender who had bestowed upon the runaway serf the title of Great Military Commander. This shadowy Tsarevich was himself merely a mirage, a puppet in the hands of Polish magnates such as Pan Mniszek, the father-in-law of the first False Dmitry, and Prince Wisniewski. Their interest was simple and cynical: to plunge Rusas into chaos, weaken it, gain land and influence, and incidentally recover debts incurred by their predecessor. False Dmitry II, hiding somewhere on the Polish-Lithuanian border, played the role of a distant yet legitimate sovereign whose will was transmitted through Bolotnikov. He was the main beneficiary, for every city captured by Bolotnikov, every peasant uprising, strengthened not just the army, but also the myth of his own miraculous salvation and right to the throne. Without this phantom, Bolotnikov would have been just one of many Ottomans, not the leader of a national movement. However, not only Polish adventurers and the shadowy pretender benefited from the raging fire. Within Russia itself, those who saw a chance for personal enrichment or political advancement joined Bolotnikov's movement. Impoverished nobles, who had nothing to lose, hoped to receive new estates and ranks from the true Tsar. Some provincial boyars, dissatisfied with the Moscow government, saw chaos as an opportunity to settle old scores and strengthen their own local power. For them, Bolotnikov was nothing more than a battering ram, breaching the existing order. And of course, the main, albeit temporary, beneficiaries were millions of oppressed peasants and serfs. Bolotnikov's enticing proclamations, promising land, freedom, and the cancellation of debts, instantly became reality in captured villages and cities. People received what they had dreamed of for centuries, even if only for a short time, paying for it with blood and inevitable retribution in the event of defeat. Now, concerning the main antagonist whose fate became inextricably linked with this grand rebellion, Tsar Vasily Shuisky. He ascended to the throne not by birthright, but as a result of a boyar conspiracy that overthrew and killed the first False Dmitry. In May 1606, just a few months before Bolotnikov's campaign began, Shuisky was proclaimed Tsar in Red Square, bypassing the Zemsky Sobor, Assembly of the Land. This circumstance, as well as suspicions of his involvement in the murder of Tsarevich Dmitry back during Boris Godunov's reign, made his power extremely precarious and vulnerable. He was a figure who lacked the sacred legitimacy that even the pretender could boast. Shuisky, an experienced but not particularly popular boyar, found himself at the epicenter of a storm that he himself had provoked by eliminating the previous Dmitry. Vasily Shuisky was an intelligent and calculating politician, but his main problem lay in the lack of popular support and deep internal contradictions within the country. He was not a Tsar by God, in the eyes of the majority, but merely one of the ambitious boyars who had seized power. Against the backdrop of widespread famine, the encirclement of peasants, and centuries of grievances, his reign was perceived as a continuation of the same injustice as under Godunov. For False Dmitry II and his Polish patrons, Świecki was an ideal target, a weak, unpopular ruler who could easily be discredited and overthrown, using the myth of the miraculously saved Tsarevich. The entire might of Bolotnikov's movement, his enticing proclamations, and calls for massacres of boyars, were aimed precisely at undermining Świecki's power. For Vasily Świecki, Bolotnikov's rebellion became an existential threat, a test of strength that his reign might not endure. He had to do more than just suppress a revolt. He had to fight an idea, a myth that was growing faster than any army. His main task was to prove that False Dmitry II was just as much an imposter as the first, and that Bolotnikov was a common brigand, not a Tsar's military commander. This was a war not only on the battlefields but also in the minds of the people, for their faith and loyalty. Świecki, understanding this, began a counter-propaganda campaign, sending out decrees that exposed Bolotnikov as a serf and an imposter, urging the population not to believe his promises. He tried to rally the nobility and service people around him, promising them privileges and lands for loyal service. However, his position was exacerbated by the fact that many of his own supporters did not trust him completely, and some even secretly sympathized with the rebels, or waited to see which way fortune would turn. All of Russian statehood, personified by Świecki, hung by a thread, and Bolotnikov, though a pawn,